The second part of matching student ability is sequencing the questions appropriately. So why is this an important piece? It's important because we often find that teachers ask questions students cannot answer. And I'm sure many of you have had the experience of asking a question and realizing, having asked a question, that students are not prepared to answer the question. And you think to yourself, oh my gosh. And you sort of like, imagine in your head, okay, I hope that someone can give me something I can work with. And the reason you ask this of yourself, and if you haven't done that, I don't believe you, because all of us have been in the situation where we ask the question that was way too difficult. So why do we ask these very challenging questions that we realize after asking them students can't answer? One reason is that basically we want to build these higher level skills. And so we think that we ought to just get to those higher level skills, and we ask these hard questions because we don't think sometimes we ought to be asking those remembering questions, those understanding level questions, and because that's not building critical thinking. We've already said it can build critical thinking. So for a moment, I want you to pause and think. Again, why is it that it's okay to ask lots of lower level questions even if we want to build critical thinking skills? So pause on that and think to yourself, why is that okay? So I hope that you have kind of thought to yourself that perhaps it's okay because they will support the critical thinking that students will do later. You might even have mentioned the fact that it will take many more, probably, understanding and remembering questions for students to build that foundation that allow them to get to the top. But also don't forget, Bloom's taxonomy is a triangle, and there are fewer questions at the top because they require so much foundational skill. So what this often results in is something that I consider really problematic, and I see so often in instruction, particularly for new teachers, but I have done it myself as an established teacher, and I've seen many of my colleagues do it. Asking students whether they know what you're about to teach. And I understand the goal here often when we ask students whether they know what we're about to teach, the goal is to sort of activate their prior knowledge. But what I always say is, if you have to ask students what you're about to teach, you might as well not be teaching the lesson, because if they know that already, why would you teach the lesson to begin with? So that's not actually activating prior knowledge. You're actually asking students to do the lesson for you. Moreover, if you get one student to tell you what you're about to teach, that doesn't say anything about the rest of the class. So don't do it. Don't ask students if they know what you're about to teach, because often the following things happen. I saw in a high school geometry lesson a teacher write the word congruence on the board and ask the students, what do you think congruence means? And these high school students with learning disabilities, one of them was like, raise his hand and says, to be next, which is not what congruence means. Congruence means to be the same shape but not necessarily the same size. And this is not what congruence means. It might be somehow related, but it's definitely not what that word means. In a middle school mathematics class, the teacher wrote the following problem on the board. This is multiplying fractions, right? So this is 2 times 1 and 3 times 2. Teacher puts this on the board, and the student actually asks students, teacher asks the students, what are we going to do? And I don't know why she asked that question. Student says, oh, I know what we're going to do. And the teacher says, okay. The student says, we're going to cross multiply, which is not right. Cross multiplying occurs when you have an equal sign in the middle and you want to change it that way. This is not the correct answer. And the student's giving us the wrong answer because the student thinks they understand based on prior knowledge. The teacher is teaching something new. So why ask what we're going to do? Don't ask what we're going to do. If you have to ask the students that question, why would you? If you can ask students that question, why would you teach the lesson? You're teaching the lesson because you think they don't know it. So don't ask what you're about to teach, okay? And you can build on that foundation. So I want to sort of bring this into a slightly different realm now to think about this in a slightly different way. And I'm going to bring in behavior here, which you'll often think about further in other parts of this course if you take all the parts of it. But we can talk about here high P requests. And high P requests are things that students are very likely to do. The P is probability, high P requests. And so I want you to listen to Kathleen Lanes, professor at the University of Kansas, who can give you an understanding why it is so effective to ask students questions that they're likely to get right from the beginning. So I'm going to pause here. You can listen to Dr. Lane. I'll jump off the screen, come back together, and we can talk briefly about that.
What you're trying to do in high P request is typically like you would ask the child to do 3 things that they're very likely to do. Okay, take out your piece of paper. Great job. Go ahead and write your name in the upper corner. Nice work. I see you got that done. Go ahead and mark an X on the first box. And then you deliver a request that they're less likely to do. And basically the goal is if I'm building momentum, I ask, they respond, I ask, they respond, I ask, I respond. Now I'm going to ask you something you're less likely to do. You're more likely to do it. And I remember the first time I ever tried this when I was a middle school teacher. I had this child who was extremely difficult, and he was just very non-compliant because he had such splinter skills. He missed a tremendous amount of school. So he didn't want to start any activity because he assumed that every activity was going to be difficult for him. So this one day, I'm like, "Can you come on up here?" And he said yes, and he came forward. So that's one. Then I said, "Would you mind passing these out to everybody?" And he passed out the papers to everybody. I'm like, "Thanks so much for doing that." And then I said, "Do you mind putting these extra copies on my desk?" And he complied. And then I said, "Okay, go ahead and start the first 3 problems." And he sat down and started right away. Normally, he would have engaged me in an argument about having to start. But he right away went and started the first 3 problems. And then he looked up at me. He knew. He said, "You tricked me into doing this." I'm like, "You're capable of doing it. It's fine." The upside of doing something like high P or differential reinforcement, you're not delivering any aversives. It's a positive experience. So it's a way of getting the kids to comply and demonstrate behaviors that you want in a very respectful way.
Okay, third part, phrasing purposefully. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because often our phrasing just destroys the question to begin with. And so what I find is that if you ask a poorly worded question, what happens when I already described to you where it's crickets in the room and you're just like thinking to yourself, please someone say something I can use. So students won't respond how you want. They'll give you some random answer you don't actually want from the students, or they won't respond at all. And either way, the question hasn't been phrased purposefully, so you're not getting what you want. Second, by contrast, you phrase the question effectively, students will respond in ways you expect, and that's exactly what we want to have happen. Another thing I want to really encourage you to not do anymore, and I'm going to say not do anymore because we all do this, including myself. I'm sure if you watch the videos again, you can find plenty of examples where I do the same thing. But asking rhetorical questions. It's a really problematic thing to do because if you ask a question like, "Any questions?" what are students going to say? Any student is going to say no. Well, most students are. And I can tell you from experience that this is true. I've taken very complex classes. Even as a professor, I sometimes audit classes in other departments. And there have been times when I do not understand what's going on. And the professor will ask any questions, and I do not say a thing because I don't want to be the one to say anything. And also in a classroom situation in, let's say, middle school or high school, there might be some peer pressure not to be the one to extend the lesson by answering the question, "Any questions?" with a yes. Another one is, does that make sense? And this is a really interesting one because you can see the attempt here is to get students to say, no, it doesn't make sense. But what, in fact, are students likely to say? They're going to say yes. Yeah, sure, it makes sense. Because you're not asking them to actually do anything. And so this is a really serious problem when we're talking about instruction because if we ask these rhetorical questions, we're going to get the wrong kind of answers. I want to encourage you to stop using these rhetorical questions in your practice, because I guarantee you, you do it at least sometimes. Instead of asking these questions, ask questions that require students to show their understanding. At whatever level is the level of the objective, I'm imagining Bloom's taxonomy as I sort of push my hand down the page here. Ask the questions that are appropriate for the objective, but ask questions that students are required to answer in a thoughtful way, not where they can simply give this one response. Also, if one kid says that makes sense, then you don't know whether the rest of the students, it makes sense to the rest of the students because only one student gave you an answer. So you cannot depend on the does that make sense in any questions, rhetorical questions. Please don't do that.